First talk, delivered by me on November the 28th, 1930, with free entrance into the assemblage of everyone without exception of the followers of my ideas belonging to the mentioned group. I began thus. Today and the day before, I seriously meditated upon how I should find such a method for my explanations, by the totality of which I intend today, and in the 2 or 3 following meetings, to make clear for you certain definite information having a close connection with your life, and to give a shape and sequence to my expositions, such as might perhaps, in the conditions created by you North Americans, in the sense of abnormally great as compared with other people's mechanism of mentation, contribute to a normal and impartial comprehension by you of this definite information. I had to ponder over it long and seriously, chiefly because of my sincere desire, now that I had the possibility, to give you some help by my explanations, you Americans composing just this group of the followers of my ideas, as people towards whom, during the period of my intercourse with you, thanks to your kind attitude towards me personally and to my work in the hard years after the misfortune which happened to me, there was formed and still is present now, constantly functioning, so to say, life-giving data for benevolence. Besides, in the same period a firm conviction gradually formed itself in me that in all of you, obviously thanks to an abnormally superfluous reading of newspaper literature, there developed, more than in other people, that abnormal psychic factor, which in the last centuries has generally become an imprescriptible inherency of contemporary people, and which very definitely, as it can be easily proved experimentally, acts on the general psyche of people in such a way as to contribute to their being satisfied by superficial assimilation of all kinds of new impressions read or heard, without evoking in them the forebodings of any bad consequences from this. As a result of these reflections, I think I succeeded finally in working out in my thoughts an approximately corresponding form of exposition. In accordance with this, so to say, scheme of exposition, I shall now first of all arouse in you and explain several such questions which, as I presume, will appear on first sight quite unfitting for what you expect to hear from me in the sense of what I have promised to say with respect to your welfare, whereas in reality only such a scheme of sequential development of the promised explanations may, in my opinion, crystallize in your abnormally constructed mental apparatus those notions, the cognition of which I consider not only very useful for you, but absolutely indispensable. First of all, I want to acquaint you with 2 of the fundamental points of that detailed programme worked out by me, which was predetermined for gradual introduction into the life of people by means of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, founded by me. This institute, by the way, was first founded by me while still in Russia, 2 years before the beginning of, as one calls it now, the World War. But I could not succeed in establishing firmly this child of mine, as one says, on its own legs, in spite of many repeated attempts to set it up in various other countries, which ended every time, thanks to all kinds of consequences of this war, with a crash accompanied for me with enormous material loss and waste of effort, which demanded almost superhuman tension of my physical and moral strength, until, as I have already said, 8 years ago in noble France. One of the paragraphs of the mentioned circumstantial programme included a detailed working out for the actualisation of that plan of mine, namely that as soon as the economic question was more or less established in the main section of the Institute and in the other sections already organised at about that time, and there was also more or less established the process of assimilation of a so-called comprehension in the nature of people working upon themselves who lived in the mentioned sections, I would begin at once to organise with the help of people who had already reached in these sections a definite degree, as it was called in all previously existing esoteric schools, of being and comprehension in every big city of the continents of Asia, Europe and North America, on which are concentrated the interests of big agglomerations of people of the given special group, public institutions of a new type, similar to the clubs existing at the present day almost everywhere in the ordinary life of people, and to introduce into the internal life of such public institutions of a new type, instead of what is already established in such particular places for a definite group of people, that is, their own regulations, principles, religions and economic opinions, etc., and instead of the already established pastimes, that is to say, reading newspapers and periodicals, playing cards, arranging balls and masquerades and various concerts, which generally, especially in these days, proceed with the gentle participation of those who, in the opinion of the majority of contemporary people, are known and famous, and, in my opinion, with the participation principally of such people who, on account of the abnormal life of their ancestors as well as their own, represent nothing more than the types who, in the period of Babylonian civilization, were designated as moving sources of an evil radiation. Well then, instead of all that, usually proceeding in similar clubs, which gives absolutely nothing for the welfare of their members and the real development of their individuality, to introduce the habit of getting acquainted gradually and in strict sequence through common reading, lectures and explanations given by people specially prepared for this purpose and sent from the mentioned sections with various fragments of that totality of theoretical information, on the principles of which the institute founded by me is based, namely that totality of information accessible to the comprehension of each contemporary man, after learning which everybody must acknowledge that, even if all this is not yet known in the life of people, it is at the same time by its truth as axiomatic as, for instance, that when it rains the pavements are wet, so that this may become, of everything that one is required to cognize in order to lead a life suitable for man and not for a wild animal, really the most important, even more indispensable than the air we breathe, and then afterwards, on the basis of and in accordance with the conviction obtained thanks to such theoretical information regarding the possibility and also the very means of achievement of the required data for one's own welfare, to undertake together the actualization of all this in practice. The second of these points, in my opinion indispensable for you to know, included the detailed working out and form of actualization of that supposition of mine, in order with the establishment of a more or less balanced tempo of life in the main section of the Institute, to subdivide immediately all the pupils according to the results obtained in their subjective inner work upon themselves, into 3 independent groups named, the first, exoteric, outer group, the second, mesoteric, middle group, and the third, esoteric, inner group. To the first, exoteric group were to belong all those who had newly entered, as well as those who had not yet acquired by their subjective merits the right to belong to the second, the mesoteric group. The pupils belonging to this second, mesoteric group, according to the fundamental programme, were to be as yet initiated only theoretically into all the questions not accessible to the average man, which have been elucidated by me personally, owing to my half a century's special searchings, both on my own and together with a specially organised group of people of the highest contemporary culture, who devoted themselves to the search for objective truth. The members of the third group, the esoteric, according to the same detailed programme, were to be initiated not only theoretically into all these questions, but also practically, and to be introduced to all the means for a real possibility of self-perfecting, but of course only after having been for a long time experimentally tried and verified in quite exceptionally planned circumstances. With the members of this third group, it is opportune to say, I just intended to devote myself to the searching for means already accessible to everyone, and to the applying of all that was learned thus, and minutely verified for the welfare of all humanity. Now, I want still, chiefly for the purpose of forming in your, as I've already said, never on earth so completely mechanised mentation, an approximate, as the ancient learned psychologists called it, linking ground for logical confrontation of my future explanations, as well as in order that you could already, though approximately, as it is said, guess why I mention just these 2 points and what relation they may have for my future projected explanations concerning your welfare. And I even find indispensable, in accordance with the same scheme of sequential explanations previously composed in my thoughts, before speaking of what has an immediate relation to you, to tell, or better to confess, that among several very definite so-called initiative factors, gradually crystallized in my subjectivism, thanks to intensive, not very agreeable experiencings repeated many times during the period of the working out and applying in life of the mentioned programme, there are 2 such factors which always, when acting as a result of lawful causes, almost every time provoke in the mental and feeling associations and experiencings of feeling, not assimilated without difficulty, of bitterness. The first of these initiative psychic factors, which even to the present time often enervates me, formed itself in me just at the time of working out this programme, thanks to an unremitting fight between themselves of my consciousness and my nature. I must tell you that, many years ago, before the organisation of the Institute, when I planned and worked out this programme in detail, not only did I have to address myself for advice and direction concerning several questions to honourable and impartial people from among those I eventually had the happiness to meet in the course of my life, and who, by the way, contrary to the opinion existing in people on the lawfulness of the established limit of human life, had already overcome 2 centuries of their existence, and some of whom were bold enough to hope to surmount even the 3rd century, but also concerning several special questions, I had often to consult various in no way remarkable people who, although they belonged to the number of authorities on certain notions in contemporary life, concerning these questions were, at the same time, as is usual for this kind of contemporary people, thoroughly stuffed with all kinds of such beautiful properties as conceit, vanity, ambition, flattery, and so on. The fact that at that time I had, with very great inner effort, as one says, to experience, and in my external relations to reckon with it, constituted the primary data for the formation in me of the first of the mentioned initiative factors. The second of the mentioned psychic factors formed itself already there on the continent of Europe in the 2nd year after I finally settled down in France in conditions, as I have already said, more or less favourable, and began to work in accordance with the previously mentioned worked-out programme, and the formation of this factor was due to the results of the self-content of several people who were in contact with me in the following conditions of my activity at that time. Notwithstanding the inevitable necessity from the very first day of my arrival in Europe to consecrate not less than half of my physical and psychic forces for the regulation of the great financial crisis created some time before, on account of the ignominious stupidity of the Roman power-possessing people, and notwithstanding that I had to consecrate the other half of the time to the theoretical explanation and practical teaching of the 70 pupils who were being specially prepared for the demonstrations of, so to say, illustrative material that was supposed to be held everywhere in Europe and America the next year, with the aim of showing the results of the application in life of my new ideas. Nevertheless, I succeeded in directing my work so that, already by the beginning of the 2nd year of the existence of the Institute in France, data were formed in me as well as in all the people who had a contact with me, and who were more or less in the current of my instructions, for a strong conviction that very soon it would be possible to realise also in practice both of the points just explained by me in the mentioned detailed programme, that is to say, to classify all the pupils living in the Institute into 3 separate groups, and to begin with each group the previously foreseen theoretical and practical studies, and, at the same time, to organise in the places where the interests of big, agglomerations of people are concentrated, the mentioned clubs of a new type. Unfortunately, nothing of the concrete consequences for general human welfare expected from this programme, which had been foreseen in the smallest detail, could be realised on account of the event known to all of you which happened to me 6 years ago, and which many learned and ordinary people, and all those who knew me and who heard about it, attributed with their usual superficial understanding merely to a motor accident, although in reality, as I supposed from the first when I recovered my senses, and as I am now quite convinced, it was the last chord of the manifestation towards me of that something usually accumulating in the common life of people, which, as is mentioned by me in the Herald of Coming Good, was first noticed by the great, really great King of Judea, Solomon, and was called Svano Hanu. Returning to a more detailed description of the facts of that time, which is necessary for your understanding of my present explanations, one must say that from the very beginning, when everything was more or less established for the ordinary existence of a great number of people in the 2 houses purchased by me in France called the Château de Prairie and Le Parador, and the construction of a special large building which afterwards was known to you under the name of the Study House had been finished in haste, I began an almost daily series of lectures for the pupils of the Institute, those who had newly entered there in Europe, as well as those who had come with me from Russia, and those who had joined during my wanderings from the Caucasus to Europe when, owing to all kinds of political complications, it had been impossible to actualise even a single paragraph of the mentioned programme, or to settle anywhere permanently, to elucidate parallel with the previous superficial outline, the details which in their totality illustrated the essence of my ideas, and to explain more substantially only that part from among 24 subdivisions of the general totality of the exposition of my ideas, the assimilation of which is absolutely obligatory for anyone to begin a productive work upon himself. For your better understanding of the further explanations given by me then, I consider it indispensable to repeat some of them now. Among other things, I said then that the most important work for a man who has already cognised with his reason his real significance, that is to say, who has cognised his error in the sense of the exaggerated importance given to his individuality, which represents, according to his own impartial appreciation in a quiet state, almost a complete nullity, is to acquire ableness to direct for a definite time all his possibilities and all his strength only for the purpose of constating as many as possible of the physical as well as the psychic abnormal facts proceeding in his various functions, that is, to exercise what is called self-observation. It is obligatorily necessary to do so chiefly in order that such undesirable facts, cognised only by his mind, which are still empty of significance for his common presence, gradually assimilating into his nature, should begin to crystallise a steady conviction about everything learned, and through this, as it must lawfully proceed, should come forth in his common presence for the possibility of further work upon himself, an energy of great intensiveness, with the help of which alone is a further work upon himself possible, and which is manifested, by the way, in a persistent striving to achieve the power during the daytime in his, so to say, waking state, for a definite time, to remember himself. This is necessary in its turn so that such a man, who has cognised only in his mind the nullity of his individuality, and who has decided to struggle consciously with the abnormalities constated by him, which are crystallised in his individuality, thanks to the unfitting surrounding conditions of his preparatory age, and which manifest themselves in all sorts of weaknesses that in totality give birth to his will-lessness, characterlessness, inertness, and so on, could learn as much as possible not to identify with the surrounding conditions and, continuing to observe his inner and outer manifestations with a simultaneous domination in himself of various feelings of partiality which are becoming inherent in him, and thus constating still more deeply various factors, abnormal even according to his own consciousness, and existing in great number in his psyche as well as in his physical body. All this with the aim of convincing himself with his whole being of his negative properties that are even in his own judgment unworthy of a man, and not only with his, in the present case, meaning nothing mind, so that thus he may again become a person wishing to work upon himself with his whole being, and not only, as I have just said, with his meaningless consciousness. On account of the great importance of this question, I repeat and underline that all this is indispensable in order that in a man working upon himself should arise and accumulate, as could only lawfully proceed, the needed energy for the possibility of continuing to work with the intensity of striving and power of action upon himself, which alone permits the transmutation of oneself from this nullity into that something which he ought to have been according to even his own good sense. This latter, although rarely, does manifest itself in such contemporary man at those moments when the surrounding conditions do not prevent the manifestation of this good sense, that is, to be such as a man ought to be, the, as is said, acme of creation, and not what he has become in reality, especially in recent times, namely as in moments of self-sincerity, he knows himself to be an automatically perceiving and in everything manifesting himself domestic animal. Now I shall speak to you in the form of a conspectus about the events which provoked the causes of my first journey to you in America, when, in the heat of my already described activity, repeated troubles began to grow again on a great scale in that fertile soil for the growth of all kinds of scandals bearing the name Russia, troubles which were related to me personally only because there were living with me many of these unfortunate biped creatures, toward whom, by the will of fate, there had been formed in me something constantly reminding and obliging me to contribute to the possible continuation of the breathing of such inevitably existing cosmic horizons, whom great nature, considering the complexity of the apparatus for an easy assimilation of air by the organism, and obviously on account of lack of time, had deprived of this apparatus, with the result that my poor Minister of Finance could not restrain himself, and again cried out, "Help! Help!" I was compelled to make the decision, without waiting for the complete preparation of the material I planned upon, to travel immediately to you Americans, people covered at that time with, so to say, a dollar deposit, with only that material which had been already more or less prepared. On my first arrival at that time in America, and during the 6-month stay here among you, I had not only successfully enough regulated the material question of the Institute, but also prepared everything required for the foundation here in America of several permanent sections. Having fully convinced myself then of the possibility in the future in North America of realizing broad plans connected with my ideas, I at once, without losing time, opened here in New York, by the way, temporary classes in rhythmic movements and in music, with the intention on my next visit, which was supposed to be 6 months later, of transforming these classes into the first fundamental branch of the Institute in America. Just in that phase of my activity for the introduction into life for the welfare of people of the programme which had been worked out in all details, there occurred, almost immediately after my return to Europe, that misfortune which, besides preventing among other things my intended journey here, became, so to say, the germ of all the subsequent misunderstandings which had an equal relation to my ideas, and also, of course, to me personally. The beginning of the multiplication and flourishing of these misunderstandings, already previously existing in great number in relation to me, and to the process for the actualization of my intentions, as well as the scattering of new ones, as if from a horn of plenty, was due chiefly to the fact that for several months after this misfortune I lost my memory entirely, and then for several months more lay in a semi-conscious state. The soil for a plentiful flourishing of all kinds of misunderstandings connected with my ideas became extraordinarily fecund, because after the mentioned misfortune, when I began gradually to recover my usual powers of a combination and memory, and thanks to the reasons already described by me in the last chapter of the first series of my writings, began to liquidate the main section as well as all the other sections of the Institute founded by me, which was established on a new basis according to the statute of the Institute, people living there of every degree of being and comprehension, most of whom belonged to various independent nations composing the population of the old Russian Empire, having no possibility of returning to their motherland, as in all these places there continued that psychosis of the masses, which began some years previously, were obliged, on account of unexpected circumstances, to disperse to various countries in Europe and to England and even America, depending on where they had friends or relatives, and most of these previous pupils of my institute, when they found themselves dispersed, had fallen into hard conditions, as still continues to be the case for almost all the refugees from this previously rich Russia, having no data necessary for a normal earning of life in the local conditions, probably suddenly remembered crumbs of the general quantity of information they had heard at the Institute, and profiting, consciously or unconsciously, that has no importance for the given case, from the general unbalancedness of mind arisen as a lawful consequence of the World War, decided to prophesy my new ideas. As each of these pupils of the Institute founded by me, in the sense of his subjective being, belonged as yet only to the mentioned exoteric group, that is to say, still had the being of an ordinary average man, and consequently possessed fully the inherencies which are proper to contemporary man, among which, obligatorily and inevitably, is this, that he can be interested and take in from everything new to him only what corresponds to his own already established subjectivity, and make it the centre of gravity of mentation. They, taking this as a basis, began among the people victims of the mentioned unbalancedness of mind to prophesy in a one-sided way verbally, as well as by literature, the information assimilated by them, one bit here and one bit there, which they had heard from me personally or from my old pupils, who were prepared by me for a future spreading of my ideas on a large scale. Here it is interesting to note that at that time my own self almost ceased, so to say, to annoy the attention of these people who were more or less acquainted with my instructions. From the numerous definite facts elucidated during my recent special observations in regard to the causes of the arising of a certain specific property in the psyche of people who have become followers of my ideas, I think that it will be, for now, enough to note, by the way, that at present, for all the people existing in different countries who have, in one way or another, become followers of my ideas, the totality of data for their psychic functioning, which in general crystallises in people thanks to various surrounding mechanical influences, becomes afterwards an automatically stimulating factor for the manifestation of their subjectivity, as a result of which these people, during their automatically flowing associations, as well as in the times of their half-conscious exchange of opinions among themselves, are animated by the necessity of arguing with enthusiasm and persistency, creating thus a really perceived and very intensely manifested idea fixe, relating only to certain, sometimes quite insignificant information, which clears up only one particular question from the numberless questions which exclusively, by their whole totality, compose and elucidate the essence of my ideas. For instance, in the, so to say, consciousness of people existing in one part of Russia, from the general totality of information which had been given to them and which they took in certainly a bit here and a bit there, only that part was firmly crystallized which, among other things, explains theoretically, by analogous examples, the fact that the common presence of man is composed of three independently formed and educated parts, and on that alone they base the probable truth of all my ideas. In a number of people existing in another part of Russia, thanks to some fragments of the explained and proved information, there was crystallized in their consciousness the one idea that a man who has never worked intentionally on his perfecting is deprived not only of a soul, but also of spirit. People from Germany, especially those from Bavaria, thanks to the information assimilated by them about the possibility of an effective nutrition not only with the ordinary food, but also with air, have taken as their fancy the idea of giving to the composition of their blood the property of being able to fulfill all the exigencies of the physical body, and at the same time to contribute to the crystallization and perfecting of the astral body. People from the capital of England were, so to say, crazy about, or better say, it suited their English soul, and became the idea fixe of their psyche, that summing up conclusion of the general totality of my theoretical information, which is formulated by the expression to remember oneself, and which was indicated as a necessity. People living in contemporary northern Greece preferred, and made the centre of gravity of their interest in my ideas, the so to say law of seven, and the three existing aspects of every event, and so on. As for you Americans, composing just this group, your idea fixe is based on separate fragments, taken in by you also, one bit here and one bit there, of that unique general part from the 24 sections already mentioned by me, forming the fundamental fractions of the general totality of information, explaining theoretically all my ideas, about which I said lately that this part concerns the question of self-observation, and underlined that this information is inevitably required at the beginning of work upon oneself.